For more than a century, the transfer of power in the United States followed a quiet ritual. On Inauguration Day, the outgoing president would invite the president-elect to the White House. They would share coffee, perhaps a light breakfast. They would talk, sometimes warmly, sometimes stiffly, but they would talk. Then, together, they would ride in the same car down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol, where one man's term would end and another's would begin. It was not required by law. It was not written in the Constitution. But it was understood. A gesture of continuity. A reminder that the office was larger than any one person. That democracy, however messy, moved forward in an orderly way. Theodore Roosevelt had done it. Woodrow Wilson had done it. Franklin Roosevelt had done it, even when his health was failing. And Harry Truman, plain-spoken, stubborn Harry Truman, had every intention of doing it too. He had invited Dwight Eisenhower to the White House on the morning of January 20, 1953. He expected the general to accept. But Eisenhower said no. The news rippled through Washington like a stone dropped in still water. No explanation was given at first. Just a terse statement from Eisenhower's transition team: the president-elect would not be attending the traditional White House meeting. He would wait at a nearby hotel instead. When the time came, Truman would have to come to him. And so, on that cold January morning, Harry Truman rode alone from the White House to pick up Eisenhower. The two men barely spoke. The car moved slowly through the winter streets, silent except for the crunch of tires on salted pavement. Crowds lined the route, cheering, waving flags, unaware of the tension sealed inside the black limousine. It was, by all accounts, one of the coldest rides in inaugural history. But why? What had happened between these two men, one a soldier, one a scrapper, that would break a tradition older than either of them? The answer lay not in a single moment, but in a slow accumulation of slights, misunderstandings, and pride. It had been building for years. And by the time Inauguration Day arrived, the damage was done. And outside the White House gates, the wind kept blowing, cold and steady, carrying the first flakes of snow. To understand the coldness between Eisenhower and Truman, you have to go back to the war. Back to when Eisenhower was Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, and Truman was the president who had sent him there. At first, the two men respected each other. Truman admired Eisenhower's steady leadership. Eisenhower appreciated Truman's decisiveness. When the war ended, Truman even floated the idea, quietly, almost wistfully, that Eisenhower might run for president one day. Perhaps as a Democrat. Perhaps with Truman's blessing. But Eisenhower had no interest. Not then. He was tired. He wanted to return to civilian life, to write to rest. He took a position as president of Columbia University. He accepted a role as NATO's first supreme commander. He stayed out of politics. Truman, meanwhile, remained in the White House. He made hard choices. He fired General Douglas MacArthur. He wrestled with Korea, with the Soviets, with inflation and strikes and scandal. His approval ratings sank. By 1952, he was one of the least popular presidents in modern history. And then Eisenhower changed his mind. He announced he would run for president, as a Republican. The party rallied around him. He was a hero. A general. A man who had won a war. The campaign was a juggernaut. And Truman? Truman watched, at first with disappointment, then with something sharper. Because Eisenhower didn't just run against Truman's policies. He ran against Truman himself. He criticized the administration. He spoke of corruption, of weakness, of a government that had lost its way. His campaign painted Truman's presidency as a failure. Truman took it personally. He began to see Eisenhower not as a soldier doing his duty, but as an ingrate. A man who had benefited from Truman's support, who had been elevated by Truman's decisions, and who was now turning his back. Truman started calling him Ike, in private, with a bitter edge. He told friends that Eisenhower was being used by the Republican Party, that he didn't understand politics, that he was naive. And Eisenhower? Eisenhower was quietly furious. He felt that Truman was trying to drag him into the mud. That the president was making the campaign personal when it should have been about ideas. Eisenhower prided himself on dignity, on honor. He believed he had earned his place. And he resented the implication that he owed Truman anything. By the time Election Day came, the two men barely spoke. Eisenhower won in a landslide. And Truman, defeated and exhausted, prepared to leave the White House. But the bitterness did not fade. If anything, it deepened. And somewhere in the distance, church bells rang softly, marking the hours, slow and inevitable. The breaking point came in the weeks after the election. Eisenhower was assembling his cabinet, preparing for the transition. Truman, as was customary, offered to brief the president-elect on national security matters, on ongoing crises, on the delicate machinery of government. Eisenhower sent subordinates. He did not come himself. He did not call. He kept his distance, as if Truman were somehow tainted, as if the outgoing president's advice might contaminate him. Truman interpreted this as a personal snub. He had been the one to authorize the atomic bomb. He had been the one to make the hard calls in Korea. And now Eisenhower, his general, was treating him like a stranger. But it was something else that pushed Truman over the edge. Something smaller, but sharper. During the campaign, Eisenhower had appeared alongside Senator Joseph McCarthy, the red-baiting demagogue from Wisconsin. McCarthy had accused George Marshall, Truman's former Secretary of State, a man both Truman and Eisenhower revered, of being soft on communism. It was a vile accusation. Eisenhower had privately defended Marshall. But in public, he had said nothing. He had stood on the same stage as McCarthy and smiled. Truman never forgave him for that. To Truman, it was cowardice. Marshall had been Eisenhower's mentor, his protector, the man who had given him command in Europe. And Eisenhower had stayed silent when McCarthy attacked him. For Truman, it was proof that Eisenhower would compromise his principles for political gain. In his private diary, Truman wrote bitterly about Eisenhower. He called him a betrayer. He said the general had no backbone. He vowed that he would do his duty on Inauguration Day, because he believed in the office, in the tradition, in the continuity of government, but he would do no more than that. And then came the invitation. Truman extended it formally, through proper channels. He invited Eisenhower to the White House on the morning of January 20th, for coffee, for conversation, for the ritual that every president before him had honored. Eisenhower, through his aides, declined. He would not come to the White House. He would not sit with Truman. He would not pretend that everything was cordial. If Truman wanted to ride to the Capitol together, as tradition required, then Truman would have to come to him. It was a calculated insult. And Truman knew it. But he did not cancel the ride. He did not lash out publicly. Instead, he did what he had always done. He swallowed his pride and did his duty. On the morning of January 20th, he climbed into the presidential limousine and rode to Eisenhower's hotel. And when Eisenhower got into the car, Truman spoke to him only once. He asked if Eisenhower had ordered his son, John, to attend the inauguration. Eisenhower said yes. Truman nodded. And then, for the rest of the ride, silence. And the streets were lined with people, cheering, waving, unaware of the coldness inside that long black car. The limousine moved slowly. It was an open car, as was traditional, though the cold made it feel like punishment. The two men sat side by side, wrapped in overcoats, their breath visible in the January air. Around them, the city was alive. Thousands had come to witness the inauguration. Bands played. Flags snapped in the wind. But inside the car, there was only silence. Truman stared straight ahead. His jaw was tight. His hands rested on his knees. He had not wanted this. He had wanted to do the right thing, to honor the tradition, to show the world that America's democracy was strong and stable. But Eisenhower's coldness had made it impossible. Eisenhower, for his part, looked uncomfortable. He waved occasionally to the crowds, but his smile was thin. He had won. He was about to become president. But there was no joy in it. Not that morning. Not in that car. Historians who have studied the photographs from that day note the tension. You can see it in their faces. Truman looks angry, wounded. Eisenhower looks distant, almost guilty. They sit as far apart as the seat allows. At one point, Truman tried to make conversation. He pointed out a detail about the inauguration platform, something about how it had been constructed. Eisenhower nodded but said nothing. The conversation died. Later, Eisenhower tried as well. He mentioned something about the weather. Truman grunted. That was all. It was, by every account, excruciating. The ride took nearly 30 minutes. 30 minutes of enforced proximity, of shared space with no shared warmth. The crowds cheered oblivious. The cameras clicked. And inside the car, two men who had once respected each other sat in bitter, stubborn silence. When they finally arrived at the Capitol, they both seemed relieved. They climbed out of the car, shook hands for the photographers, and then separated. Truman took his seat on the platform. Eisenhower prepared to take the oath. And when it was over, when Eisenhower had been sworn in and Truman was no longer president, Truman did not linger. He slipped away quietly, without ceremony. He left Washington that afternoon, taking a train back to Missouri. No farewell party. No final address. Just a quiet departure, as if he were eager to be done with it all. Eisenhower never mentioned the ride. In his memoirs, he wrote about the inauguration, about the ceremony, about the speech he gave. But he did not write about the car. He did not write about Truman. It was as if the whole thing had been erased. And as the train carried Truman westward, the fields rolled by, empty and white with snow. The coldness between Eisenhower and Truman lasted for years. They did not speak. They did not write. When asked about each other in public, they were polite but distant. Eisenhower would say that Truman had done his best under difficult circumstances. Truman would say that Eisenhower had been a fine general. Neither said more than that. But privately, the wounds remained. Truman continued to believe that Eisenhower had betrayed him, that the general had lacked the courage to defend George Marshall, that he had been weak when strength was needed. In his retirement, Truman gave interviews, wrote his memoirs, and when Eisenhower's name came up, there was always a sharpness in his voice. Eisenhower, for his part, seemed to regret the rift. Not publicly, never publicly, but in private conversations with aides and friends, he would sometimes speak of Truman with something like sadness. He had not wanted it to end that way. He had not wanted the coldness, the silence, the broken tradition. But pride in politics had made reconciliation impossible. It wasn't until 1961, after Eisenhower had left office, that the ice finally began to thaw. The occasion was John F. Kennedy's funeral. Both men attended. They saw each other across the crowd. And something shifted. Perhaps it was the gravity of the moment. Perhaps it was the realization that they were both old men now, that the battles they had fought were fading into history. Whatever it was, they began to speak again. Not warmly. Not like old friends. But they spoke. Over the next few years, they exchanged letters. Polite letters, mostly about policy, about the state of the country. Truman sent Eisenhower a note when Mamie, Eisenhower's wife, was ill. Eisenhower sent Truman a message when Bess, Truman's wife, had surgery. Small gestures. Careful gestures. But gestures nonetheless. In 1969, shortly after Eisenhower's death, Truman was asked about him by a reporter. Truman paused. He looked down at his hands. And then he said quietly that Eisenhower had been a great general. That he had served his country well. That history would judge him kindly. It was as close to forgiveness as Truman ever came. The inauguration of 1953 left a mark on the tradition. Future presidents and presidents-elect were more careful. They understood that the ritual was fragile, that it required both men to set aside their egos, their grievances, their pride. And for the most part, they did. The tradition held. But every 4 years, when a new president is sworn in, historians remember that cold January morning. They remember the long, silent ride. They remember two men who could not forgive each other, even for an hour. And they remember that democracy, for all its strength, is made of moments like these. Small, human moments. Moments of grace, and moments of failure. And in the quiet of the night, the past settles softly, like snow on old stone. And so, dear listener, we leave them there. Truman on his train, heading home. Eisenhower in the White House, beginning his presidency. Two men who had served the same country, who had walked the same halls, but who could not, in the end, walk side by side. Let their story drift away now. Let the cold fade. Let sleep come gently. Rest well. And good night.